Zack Snyder is back with a new film for Netflix, the start of a new Snyderverse, if you will, Rebel Moon Part 1, A Child of Fire. And I believe releasing after Part 2 comes out in April of next year, we'll be getting a Snyder cut, a director's cut of this film, and of course Part 2 as well at some point. And I think it's over an hour of extra footage in the director's cut. Now with that being said, knowing ahead of time that there is a good amount of stuff missing from this movie, you can definitely feel it at times. Now with that being said, I overall enjoyed this movie for the most part. There are some things that I wish were better, and I'm hoping that the director's cut will fix some of these issues. For example, character development. Now, understanding that this is part one of 2 films he shot back to back, so there's probably going to be more character development just in general with part 2 when it comes out in April. However, besides Korra, the lead in this movie, everyone else is pretty much just there, and you may learn a bit of them here and there, but realistically, it's really focused on her and her past, which we see a good portion of that in the actual marketing of part 1 here. But besides her backstory and some other information, the majority of other characters, they do some cool stuff. We learn some interesting information about them, but they're just kind of there. And to me, it's like, I want to learn more about that character. I want to learn more about that character. But you really don't. Like, you get some information about their history at times, or a little bit of backstory. There's actually a scene, I'm not going to spoil it. There's actually a scene that it's like quick fire, rapid succession of short little bursts of information for each character. And it feels, and honestly feels like that was intentional so that you learn more information about each of the characters in quick succession. Because up to that point, yeah, you may have known a little bit about this character and you might have learned more about her history or whatever. But then there's some more information thrown at you like really fast, and then we move on to the next character. It was like, okay, I see what you're doing here. Look, I love the concept of Rebel Moon. I think the idea of Snyder wanting to create his own universe and it expanding, because we go to a variety of different locations in this movie alone. I'm excited to see what happens in part 2 and potentially further on if we get more, because there's a lot of potential in terms of stories and characters we could be introduced to outside of these core characters we're introduced to in part 1 and then leading into part 2. There's other stories that can be told and expanding the Rebel Moon universe, this new Snyderverse. So I think the concept of what Snyder's doing here is really interesting. Unfortunately, this version of the film is lacking in terms of character development besides Korra, like I mentioned. And, you know, I feel like that's really key. And I feel like that's going to be a deterrent for some people. They're going to be like, well, we really don't know much about this character and this character and this character, so why should I care? Now, with all that being said, the action in this film is exactly what you would expect from Zack Snyder. A lot of slow-mo, some crazy action. You can definitely tell they're holding back in terms of the actual R-rated stuff, because this version of the film is PG-13. The director's cut is R-rated. There are definitely moments where either they're cutting away from certain things or just not having any blood splatter or whatever. It's clear this is edited down. And I wish this Netflix would have just allowed him to just put out the version he wanted initially, which is the 3-hour-ish version of the film, the R-rated version. Just let him do it, because this film wasn't getting a theatrical release. I believe it's played in some theaters for critics, and I think there's like a fan screening or a couple here or there. Like, there was some screenings of this version of the film, but Netflix never intended for this to have even a short theatrical run, which they have with some of their other films. I'm not sure why they didn't at least give it to them or whatever. But if that's the case, if they were thinking that ahead, or at least that was the goal, why not just let him put out the lengthier, the 3-hour plus version of the R-rated version, the director's cut? Why not just allow that to be the final version of the film? And there's a lot of discussion about this, and I think it is kind of true in a sense. I think Netflix was trying to do their own Snyder cut situation, where we had the whole Justice League fiasco and everything, and I think it feels like Netflix is trying to do this whole thing to where you get a PG-13 shorter cut, and then you get the R-rated Snyder cut, the director's cut. And I'm just like, just put out the intended version. I think Snyder's probably still happy with this version, obviously, or else he wouldn't have put this out, or at least he wouldn't have put out this version of the film. But I'm really curious to see what the 3-hour, the director's cut, Snyder cut of this movie is, because it probably fixes some of the issues I have in terms of the character development, and just, it feels like at times there's scenes that are just like missing, or scenes that are cut down. Like, I'm really curious what all was cut from this movie to make it to where it is now. the story here is on the simpler side in terms of rebelling, in terms of Rebel Moon. You kind of understand the title once you get into the movie. So I think the initial story of why Korra is doing what she's doing in terms of recruiting these individuals to fight back against the Mother World, as they call it. I believe that's what they call it, the Mother World. But anyways, like, the story behind all of this is simple, but there's so much more going on with it besides just, oh, a bunch of people just getting together just to fight back against the enemies. Like, there's more going on here because of their past and how they're connected to all of this destruction and everything. And like I was mentioning earlier, like, there's so much potential and ideas that they could potentially do with this world and with this universe, because there's so many possibilities now. Because even with the few locations we go to within this film, there's a lot of like other potential stories or characters they could bring forth within these different planets that we go to, that we could see stories of, just it's just there if they want to do it. Is this version of Rebel Moon Part 1 A Child of Fire worth watching? In my opinion, it is, because there are a lot of great concepts. I think some of the characters are interesting, even though they are lacking in development. I do like Korra as the lead. I think she did great. Sophia, I pronounce her last name, but Sophia did a great job, in my opinion, as Korra. I did see this online, and I do want to respond to it in this video here. After watching the movie, I went to Twitter, and I saw where someone had said there's a lot of characters introduced in this movie that instantly die off. That is not true. At least from my experience, there isn't a lot of characters introduced that just get killed off soon after. That's not true at all. I think that person was just being over exaggerating to just try to get basically social media attention or whatever. But this movie does have some moments where I'm like, really? Did you have to do that exactly? But then again, who knows? Maybe the director's cut will actually maybe explain more of these decisions more clearly, or whatever. We'll see. But I think Zack Snyder as a whole has come up with something pretty interesting, and I'm glad that the initial pitch for it to be a Star Wars project years and years and years ago was rejected, because now we have a new universe that he can start building out and creating more content and potential TV shows and all that kind of, like, there's so many things they could do within this, because it's now forever expanding, because now it's a whole brand new world, it's a whole new IP they can do something with. So maybe they will. But I think it really depends on how this film in Part 2 and how the director's cuts of both films do on the platform will determine if we get Part 3, if we get more stories set within Rebel Moon. But as it is right now, this film succeeds in certain areas in terms of the action, Korra, some of the concepts in terms of things that could be expanded upon, and some of the character moments are pretty interesting. It does, like I was saying, it lacks in character development and just pacing issues because of the cuts and everything, and there's like moments where it feels like, okay, we're getting to things a little too fast, and I think it's because of the cutting of scenes that would maybe build up to something more. So yeah, it is what it is. I should have I was expecting more in terms of this, and I got some really cool things. I just want more. And so I'm hoping the director's cut will make me more satisfied in terms of what Zack was trying to do here. But I think after I see Part 1, of course now I've already seen Part 1, but seeing Part 2, maybe that'll be a better experience in terms of seeing both now films, but these are both cut down versions. So maybe the both director's cuts will make me go, okay, this is what I'm looking for. So maybe we'll see about that. We'll see if that actually happens. Who knows? But that's my review of Rebel Moon. I don't want to go into too much detail. I don't want to go into spoilers, because there are some pretty interesting developments and twists, if you will, in the film that I think definitely leads into some really interesting, hopefully, stuff in Part 2. But I definitely want to talk again once the director's cut comes out and kind of talk about hopefully the improvements from the director's cut versus this version, because I'm hoping that with that extra footage, which is pretty lengthy, that we actually get some things that kind of course correct some of my problems and everything. We'll see what happens though. But anyways, that's the video. Hope you guys enjoyed the review. I'll talk to you guys soon. Peace out.